Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this event of the German-British Association in Berlin. I'm Rupert Straffis, the Deputy Chairman, and I have the pleasure to chair this session tonight. Just a few household remarks before we actually get started. As you may have realized, our last session was recorded and the recording is now up on our website for everybody to see. And we're very grateful to tonight's speaker that he has consented to the same procedure. So tonight's session will also be recorded and will be up on our website in a few days from now. It takes a little while to get it organized. The other household remark is that, of course, after the talk, there will be a Q&A session, and you're invited to put your comments and questions in the chat facility, and then we will take them as we go along. So now, we're very glad to welcome Simon Winder here, tonight's speaker. And we're very glad to welcome a number of people from all over Germany and beyond. It's become a custom, it's one of the good sides of doing it all online, that we spread our invitations to the other German-British associations in Germany, and they've been taking it up. So we have friends from all kinds of other organizations who are with us tonight, and a special welcome goes out to them. We've become very used to talk about Brexit and, of course, COVID-19 and Donald Trump on occasion and Ireland and all kinds of hot subjects. And what we're going to do tonight is take a real plunge into the early Middle Ages. But not just that, we're taking a plunge into the center of Europe and a view presented by an Englishman. Anyway, I hope you're English. I didn't really ask whether you're Welsh or Scottish or something, but you're really English. Anyway, an Englishman's view, and it's not the first book he's written. This is the third volume in what he would like to call, and what we would, of course, adopt as a trilogy. First volume on Germany came out in 2010, and there was a second volume, which I think has to do with the Habsburgs in 2016, and now a third volume, which in English is called Lotharingia, and probably not that many people know what Lotharingia is, and it'll be explained to you in a moment. For some mysterious reason, the German edition of this book, and I'll show it to you here, has this rather nondescript title of Herzland, because obviously the German publishers thought that Germans were even less educated and could not imagine what Lotharingia might mean. Anyway, we're very happy to have you here, Simon, and without further ado, please explain to us what it is.
Thank you, Rupert. And I'm very grateful to you and Murray for asking me to talk to everyone this evening. My own interest in Germany goes back to, I used to live in New York in the late 1980s and in the 1990s. And sitting there, I was absolutely, like everyone, gripped by the end of the Cold War. I was amazed when the Berlin Wall came down. And I remember a couple of years after the wall came down, reading a remarkable book called The Making of Europe by a young British historian called Robert Bartlett, which described the process by which Europe gradually moved east during the Middle Ages, and talked very winningly about towns like Magdeburg. And I remember feeling, this was in 1992, I felt I simply had to come to Germany. I hardly spent any time there, and that I wanted to see these places. I wanted to see Eastern Germany before it became more like the rest of Germany. And I thought this was an urgent thing for me to do, and I don't know why now. So I came over and spent an amazing couple of weeks in Magdeburg, Dresden, and elsewhere. And I've been visiting Germany ever since. And in the end, I wrote this book, Germania, this one, which was really a description of my interests and why I felt everyone should be interested in German history, particularly not just the Middle Ages, but all periods, really. I just found it absolutely fascinating. I feel that England and Germany are very similar countries in various odd ways. And when I finished the book, everyone liked the book very much, but it turned out I'd been rather incompetent in the way I wrote it, because I'd missed out effectively the German-speaking world in the East. I'd missed out Austria, I'd missed out all the Habsburg material. So through my own foolishness, I had to write another book, Danubia, which described the German-speaking worlds to the east of the modern Federal Republic. And when I finished that, I thought I'd finished completely. But then I realized that I'd again been incompetent because I hadn't really talked about the borders in the West. So I then wrote this book, Lotharingia, about the Western border areas. And now I can say, hand on heart, that I've completed my work on the subject, but it has taken a much longer time and many more pages than it was meant to. And I thought I should talk you through my thinking around why I wrote this last book, Lotharingia or Herzland, because it is a very interesting question. I found while I was thinking about Germany that there is a fascinating question about the nature of Europe, which the Western German borders and its borders with France, Switzerland, with Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands tells you something very odd about Europe. Now, if you look at the first slide here, this is a map of the world in about 1910, I think, roughly. And like now, most countries are very big. Most human beings live in very large countries. They live in India or China or Russia, or they live in the United States or Brazil, or they live in countries which are very broken up by geography. So much of Africa is very much broken up by its geography. But nonetheless, you have enormous places such as Sudan, which is more or less the size of the whole of Western Europe, for example. And so it's been normal for human civilization to coalesce into very big units. But the one exception is Europe. Why is Europe different, really, from the rest of the world? What is it about Europe that encourages the existence of what, by international standards, are extremely small states? How can somewhere as small as Denmark exist, for example? And there are a number of arguments about this, of course. That Europe is unique because it has this huge coastline. Much of the rest, somewhere like China, most people living in China traditionally have never seen the sea. There's never been any need to. You live hundreds of miles away from the sea. Whereas the river system and the coasts do break up Europe in a very strange way. But for me, that seemed only a slightly interesting explanation. A much more interesting explanation is what is it about Europe that prevents Europe from becoming a single large place? Why is every attempt to, there have been numerous invaders in numerous countries within Europe who have tried over and over again to invade other parts of Europe, but they've always failed. And if you look down in the southeast of this map, you have the Ottoman Empire, which is huge, and originally absorbed places like Hungary and Slovakia. You have Russia, which again is a huge state. And then you have these densely populated urban states, each of which is really very small. And the origins of this, it came to me after a while thinking about it, was if you look at, this is a map of the famous border of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire, Romans really do make a very good attempt to take over as much of Europe as possible. They successfully invade everywhere from Spain to England to the Balkans. But they eventually come up against this border here, down the Rhine, where there are a number of obviously very famous German towns already existing: Cologne, Cologne, Bonn, Bonn, and so on. This border in red along here split much of Europe into two parts. Either you were in the Roman Empire or you were outside the Roman Empire. And this implied that Western Europe, most of Europe, would be broken in two pieces. And for a long period of time, famously, this is how Europe was managed. Everywhere to the west of this line followed Roman law, and everywhere to the east was a mass of different tribes speaking various different languages, moving around famously. This seemed to last for a long time. Many years later, here, this is Charlemagne's empire, the Frankish Empire, which takes over from much of the old German Empire, and is obsessed with the German Empire. Charlemagne and has his scholars at his court up here in Aachen, and they spend all their time really discussing how to be like the Romans. You know, this is the new Roman Empire. If you're living in places like Trier or whatever, you're surrounded by huge Roman remains, much bigger remains than now. A lot of the towns along the Rhine here would have been mainly built from old Roman material. And so that everyone alive then is very aware. So this is around 800 or so, 800 AD. And each year, Charlemagne and his men march to the east, to these areas, to Saxony. They go over the old Roman line and spread out further and take over Saxony, most importantly. And they get as far as Hungary at one point. And what they're trying to do is genuinely recreate the Roman Empire. And they get very close. You know, they get down into Spain, famously the Song of Roland down here, where they're defeated. They never really get anywhere near Britain. But gradually each year, it's understood that the campaigning season, you will go up the Ruhr, up here, and then into Saxony, and gradually move forward. But various things go wrong with this plan. Most importantly, Charlemagne himself dies. Following that, it turns out that the campaigns each year where he's fighting the Saxons in Saxony up here, it turns out the Saxons are very tough warriors because they've been engaged for many years with fighting the Danes, the Vikings up here. And accidentally, Charlemagne's destruction of Saxony means that the Vikings are suddenly free to do other things than fight the Saxons. Still along this border here, you have these ancient fortifications showing the borders between the Saxons and the Danes. And this was a huge war that went on for generations. But when the Saxons are defeated, it releases the Danes, and they famously invent longboats, and they ruin a large part of Europe over a century or so. They are able to invade and take over England, Ireland, parts of France, and it's a miserable time. But also, as importantly, the empire that Charlemagne created collapses. It turns out to be what he invented, and it really died with him. His son was more or less useless, and his son in turn took over. And just by accident, he had 3 sons here. These 3 sons all wanted to rule this huge empire. And because it's purely an accident that there were 3 of them, it was decided as Charlemagne's son, Louis, became more and more ill, that when he died, this huge empire, which was becoming very difficult to run, should be split into 3 pieces. And it was only because there were 3 sons that this happened. So one son went west and created France, one son went east and created Germany, and one son took over this area here, Lotharingia, which was the area in between the 2 main blocks of France and Germany. And also, I love this picture. It's a very charming medieval painting. The original is extremely small, it's only about this big. But it does show beautifully what was involved in splitting up the empire. Because when these three men took over France, Lotharingia, and Germany, they were all equally important. If you were the king of France, or if you were the king of Germany, you felt that you had a right to the bit in the middle. And so here we are in the 9th century, with both France and Germany gradually turning into real separate countries, both thinking that they have the right to take over. And so here is a marvelous map showing what happened after the splitting Western Europe into 3 bits. So here you have France, here you have Germany, and here you have Lotharingia, the green bit all the way down. And as you can see, that if you are in France or if you are in Germany, it's very tempting indeed to try and invade this bit here, because it's seen as being ridiculous that it should be there, but also that both sides feel they're very confident that they should run it. But what's strange about this area of Europe is that people living in Lotharingia, they gradually over the centuries take on their own identity. And their identity is a negative identity to do with not being French and not being German. And many of them speak French, many of them speak German, many of them create their own language, so most importantly Dutch, gradually becomes distant from German. And over the following centuries, you can tell the whole story, really, of Western Europe through who owns this bit of land here. And it turns out to be very wealthy. It runs along the west bank of the Rhine, has a huge river system here. It has access to, the Dutch have access to one of the great inventions of the Middle Ages, which is pickled herring. And their invention of pickled herring allows the Dutch along here to feed the rest of Europe in the winters. It's never very rich. The French are much richer. The Germans are very much distracted by fighting people in the east. And so quite often the Germans will be trying to extend further eastward and therefore removing the pressure on Lotharingia here. And by the late Middle Ages, you have 2 major new nationalities emerging in Lotharingia. So you have the Dutch in the north and you have the Swiss in the south. And for different reasons, so the Dutch in the north, of course, it's all very flat country, it's water. And they use water to protect themselves from outsiders. So very early on, the Dutch discover amazing new technologies to do with water and the ability to protect themselves from invasion, either by France or by Germany. And famously, the Swiss, of course, their equivalent of water is mountains. And so they're able to withdraw into these mountains and essentially be left alone. And you can then tell the story of much of subsequent European history by the attempts by the French and the Germans to defeat the Dutch and defeat the Swiss. And this is a very complicated, long-standing story. But effectively, the Swiss, for example, they tend to live on they have aristocracies but without kings in both cases. In the Dutch, the Dutch are very outward-looking. They have a very close relationship with England. There's a great deal of trade. And all these battles which people read about, in which all this area up here is scattered, obviously, with endless castles from the Middle Ages. It's incredible how long it takes. These battles go on for years and years, these enormous invasion forces, and yet they're only able to take over very small areas, really. And in the area that becomes Switzerland, which is ruled by the Habsburg Empire, but is sort of left alone, the Habsburgs make several huge attempts to invade it, really with their main armies. And the Swiss, in each case, easily beat them. And it's unclear why they beat them so easily. It seems to be a sort of technology that they have, particularly the use of long pikes. but also that they're determined to defend their homeland. And that obviously is a greater motive than if you're a mercenary or if you're forced to be part of an army. And after a while, there's a marvelous period in the 15th century where the Habsburg armies are so completely defeated that the Habsburgs decide, I think for several generations, simply to pretend that Switzerland is part of the Habsburg Empire. And no one ever mentions it. So several emperors, they don't change their maps at all. They show this area as part of the Habsburg Empire, but it's understood that no one's ever going to mention the fact that it's not. And then from this side too, you have the French taking it over. So Burgundy in the late Middle Ages becomes a very important part of France. And a chunk of Lotharingia is taken over by the French, just as they do take over these areas here. And the Duchy of Burgundy, which is one of the most important parts, one of the most important noblemen in France, is the Duke of Burgundy. In the late Middle Ages, he gradually collects all the bits of Lotharingia. It's like someone collecting sort of things that you get given away in packets of cereal. You could gradually get hold of all the different bits, reflecting different cards or football cards sometimes. And he and his children marry and invade various bits of Lotharingia and recreate it. So here's France, here's Germany, the Holy Roman Empire as it's now known. And then this bit in the middle is over 4 generations of these remarkable dukes. They gradually put together all these bits into a single place. And then towards the end, the last duke, Charles the Bold, fills in the bits which are missing, these bits here. He invades these. And so he's able to join up all his territories. But in these great battles and marriage ceremonies in the 1470s, the end of Burgundy is created, really. Because when he recreates this area here, enormous numbers of people in the neighboring, both in France and Germany, really feel this is deeply dangerous. This is too dangerous. The whole area here is now going to be taken over by this to create Lotharingia as a new state permanently. Again, disastrously for Charles the Bold, he decides to add Switzerland. So instead of learning the lesson of previous invaders, he thinks he can take over the Swiss. So with a huge army, he invades Switzerland and is completely defeated. There are still places in Switzerland where you can see some of the booty that was taken from these battles. It's really it's a remarkable story that this small area is able to defeat this absolutely huge state-of-the-art army. And Charles the Bold reels back here, and then all his other enemies, he has numerous enemies at this point, they all descend on him, and he's crushed at the Battle of Waterloo. And he becomes one of the very few great rulers to actually be stupid enough to be defeated in battle rather than escaping. So he, there he is. This is a really terrible French 19th century painting, but this shows Charles the Bold found on the battlefield outside the town of Nancy. It was this frozen wilderness, and really it was the end of an era. In many ways, you can say the Middle Ages ended with Charles the Bold's death, because the future lay much more with proper kings. He was one of the last dukes who felt he could run an independent state. And with his death, go back to this. Before he died, he didn't have a son. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather cleverly all had sons who took over. But he did have this daughter called Mary. And Mary the Rich decides the future of Europe. She's suddenly called Mary the Rich because she suddenly becomes extremely rich. But she sits here wondering what to do with herself. She's in her teens, and the king of France or the Emperor of Germany. And she has, well, not she, but her advisors have to decide who is she going to marry. And there's King Louis in Paris, who makes the disastrous mistake of being an incredibly nasty man, and who threatens her and simply insists that as the ruler of these areas, he will just rule her. He will take over her and marry her and take all these territories back. But luckily, the Habsburgs have Maximilian as their emperor, who's younger, who's actually rather charming, and makes the clever decision to bribe a number of people around Mary rather than threaten them. And he comes and marries her, and this whole huge area then becomes part of the Habsburg Empire. It's an enormous increase. Some of these are the richest parts of Europe, particularly this area here. This is where all the clothing in Europe is made. It's staggeringly rich. So for a while, Maximilian becomes, by a long way, the most wealthy person in Europe. And this is France's disastrous decision. Certainly, you would say that if Mary the Rich had married the French king, then all this would have been absorbed by France. And yeah, it's fascinating to think of what would have been different. And so the subsequent centuries really are to do with the French attempts to get back some of this stuff. And the Habsburgs and the French fight each other endlessly, with the kings of England also being involved. But in the end, it's decided that in the end, this tendency for the bit between France and Germany to split off becomes once again the case. And so it's decided by the Habsburg family that they simply cannot rule such a huge area, because they've also wound up ruling Spain, Latin America, and elsewhere, Portugal. And it's decided eventually that the Spanish should rule these areas from Madrid, which is an insane decision, because the Holy Roman Empire already had it. So you have the Habsburg rulers over in the east here, and they're constantly having to fight the Ottomans down here. And they feel in the end they have to split the empire and hand over to their cousins in Madrid. So a large part of what was Lotharingia becomes ruled by the Spanish. And then there's a separate Duke of Lorraine who rules these areas, which again are separate. And originally the Spanish Netherlands includes the whole of the north as well. And again, you can see how much of European history is really based around this strange idea that the Spanish, even though it's incredibly difficult for them to supply these territories, that they have to take, there's a thing called the Spanish Road down in the south, which is a series of valleys which they pay to be able to allow to take their troops up so they can come up there, and it's very easy to shut. Or they have to come through the channel, which again can be very easily shut by the French or the English. But incredible quantities of, for 80 years, when the Dutch in the north really cannot bear Spanish rule, they split off, and the Spanish and the Dutch fight each other for 80 years. And it's really one of the most extraordinary features of European life for many years, is this immense battle that goes on for generations. And in both cases, being in cultural terms, being invaluable. The number of great artists of different kinds, great technical innovations happening in Lotharingia during this period is absolutely extraordinary. And everyone knows the story. In the end, the north splits off successfully, and the south doesn't split off. The north becomes fully Protestant, and the south remains Catholic. And the Spanish continue to rule it until eventually it's handed over to the Austrians. But the sheer cultural dynamism of this area is something which we must all always be grateful for. In a way, that the Dutch, in order to keep their independence, or make themselves independent at all, are obliged to look for sources elsewhere, and they start to investigate North America, South America, Asia, and so on. And meanwhile, the Swiss keep themselves to themselves, and it's understood if anyone attacks them, they'll be attacked back and probably beaten. But no one pays any attention to the Swiss for many years. It's a very quiet area where Swiss nationalism gradually develops. This is one of the most famous paintings. I show this picture because it is one of the most marvelous paintings ever painted, I would say. This is the at the end of the 80 Years' War between the Dutch and the Spanish. This is the city of Breda in the background, a Catholic city which the Dutch defend and eventually surrender to the Spanish. This painting by Velázquez was created for the Great Hall of Victories in Madrid, and shows the Dutch, obviously to the west, to the left of the picture, and the Spanish. And the key, this is showing the chivalry of the Spanish, that they're honourably accepting the surrender after this huge, endless siege. And here's the key to Breda being passed to Spinola, the Spanish, in fact Italian captain. Curiously, though this is a picture showing the Dutch and the Spanish, in fact, almost all the Spanish at this point were Italian. These were Italian mercenaries fighting in the Netherlands, and most of the Dutch were, in fact, Germans, because both sides had fought for so long that they had almost run out of native troops. They had to employ mercenaries. But Velázquez took so long to do this painting that by the time it was finished, in fact, embarrassingly, the Dutch had taken Breda back. So Breda became part of the Netherlands, and in 1648 it was agreed Breda should become part of the Netherlands rather than part of the Spanish Empire. And Breda has remained, like Maastricht, a strange anomaly of essentially a Catholic town in the Netherlands, which is otherwise broadly Protestant. And again, just looking at this picture, you can see this incredible breakthrough whereby the Dutch, in order to rule these Catholic towns, and they had to promise that they would observe, they wouldn't change the religion of towns like Breda, the Dutch were forced to come up with a form of tolerance on religious issues, which again was quite new. Because, the Spanish effectively saw their empire on purely Catholic imperial terms. But here in this part of Lotharingia, this very attractive town of Breda, which I spent much time in, you have this new view of the world, which allows for the idea of religious difference. And what a huge difference that makes to how Europe then works itself out. You have a major state, very wealthy state, the Netherlands, which pioneers the idea that that you can have any form of Christianity. In fact, of course, Jews are also welcomed in Amsterdam. And this, however provisional and however many Dutch may dislike it, they become this great home for different forms of tolerance. And famously, say, the Pilgrim Fathers, for example, who settled North America, they spend some years living, they flee from England into the Netherlands, and they spend some years there before they move on to America, because the Dutch allow them to. So again, this is all thanks to Lotharingia's existence. The 18th century is really spent in endless fighting in Lotharingia as the Dutch gradually become less powerful. And I feel I'm slightly running out of time, so I need to fast forward with it. But this is a fascinating map showing the one time, really, where one of two times when Lotharingia was at last destroyed. So Napoleon's conquests in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, he gradually absorbs all the spaces that are part of Lotharingia and closes the gap between Germany and France. And all these places, which are now obviously famously parts of Rhineland, Germany, are all incorporated into France. So he ends Lotharingia. He takes over all these places are simply French départements, Bouches du Rhin, Issel Supérieur, and these strange places. Even Hamburg is absorbed into France. Bouches de l'Aube. It's a very unfamiliar map, parts of Italy. But it's a very strange change, and as we know, temporary. Effectively, it can't be allowed to carry on. So this is the result of the Battle of Waterloo. Again, the Battle of Waterloo, fought in Lotharingia, the classic Lotharingian battle, where the French and the Prussians and the English all fight each other, and the French wind up being defeated. But the disappearance of the old, the strangeness of this territory here, meant that there was no going back to all the small states that used to be based there. And this map, to me, explains the whole of the 19th and 20th centuries, because after the many, many years of fighting Napoleon, the English and the Germans and the Dutch are very keen that this should never happen again. What do you do to make sure that France never again tries to threaten Europe? And originally the British ruled this area here around Amiens, which strangely Amiens then becomes the headquarters of the British Army in the First World War, which again is not a surprising seeing as a Lotharingia area. But the English retreat and decide to hand it back to France. But there are very complicated negotiations which go on about how to stop France. And so the Netherlands is given the whole of what had been the old Spanish and Austrian Netherlands to make a large Dutch state, so that the Dutch have a border with France. So that if the French ever threaten anyone, the Dutch can invade. The English make guarantees about navies, about the navy. So they have these bases, including Heligoland up here, which is designed so that the French are unable to use these seas without English permission. But the most important thing they do is they insist that Prussia has a border with France. And this is new. Prussia is mainly based in the east, with some very small territories in the west. And many Prussians in Berlin are very against this. They see Prussia's future lies in the east. But in order to make sure that France remains defeated, the Rhineland provinces are created, Westphalia and so on. And there's this border created with France to allow Prussia to invade, again, if the French do anything which the French or the British or the Dutch disagree with. And this setup means that for Lotharingian reasons, the French view this area as illegitimate. They have been caged in by the English and the Dutch and the Prussians, and they should have this area themselves. So they, for example, support Belgian independence because it allows new influence. That's one of the great issues of the 1830s, is of course how the Kingdom of the Netherlands breaks in half, and the southern half becomes a separate state. And again, it becomes a strange state. It becomes neutral because it's part of Lotharingia. And so the only way of keeping it separate is that England, France, and Prussia cannot, and the Dutch can't have anything to do with it. Belgium is created as a negative zone in order to ensure that no one has anything to do with it. And then this sits there like a booby trap from 1830 to 1914, when the invasion of Belgium at the beginning of the First World War triggers a series of events which no one would have imagined earlier on that these issues would become so important. And of course, the Franco-Prussian War is a result of who is going to run Lorraine, Lotharingia. It's impossible. Both France and Germany both have long histories of interest in that area. This is just a fun picture. This is a wonderful fantasy by a Prussian artist of the Rhineland after it becomes part of Prussia. And originally, Prussia's interest in the Rhineland is very much a romantic one. It's viewed as this area of great Gothic cathedrals, of the kind of mercantile German separateness, and of course it's Catholic. And so the Prussians again have to deal with the idea of a Protestant state with a large Catholic minority. And then this is a late 19th century picture, a very poisonous picture in many ways. This is a picture of a French propaganda picture showing French children being taught about Alsace and Lorraine. So here's a map of France. This is after the Franco-Prussian War, where very controversially it was decided to absorb Alsace and Lorraine into Germany. But it was not controversial if you were German, because it was understood that Alsace and Lorraine had a long Germanic heritage. But from a French point of view, it's completely obnoxious. And both sides had a dangerous form of nationalism that meant no one could ever forget Alsace and Lorraine. The French spent huge amounts of money on statues of Alsace and Lorraine as crying girls, or there's a huge statue of Strasbourg in Paris, which was covered in black mourning crepe from 1871 to the end of the First World War. And again, so here is a picture of the Western Front. And the Western Front, the trenches of the Western Front go straight through Lotharingia. There's a picture of Australian troops in Belgium, near Passchendaele, and yeah, this is what happens when it goes wrong. This is a fascinating picture. This is this is Kaiser Wilhelm, obviously, and his generals just before the end of the First World War, where their headquarters is in Spa. This is the main gambling hall in Spa, which was used by the German chief general staff. And this is a fascinating example to me of why Lotharingia works. So here they are in Spa, a Belgian town, which just happens to have large buildings that can be used by the military. And a few days after this picture is taken, many of the people in this picture have a discussion with Kaiser Wilhelm, where it's clear that the war is lost and the Kaiser must go. The Kaiser revolution has broken out in Berlin, suddenly it's clear that these very confident looking men in this photo, a couple of weeks later, they're absolutely shattered with anxiety about what's going to happen. And the Kaiser, who has made all kinds of ridiculous mistakes really during the war, and is, by 1918 is a much disliked figure. It's clear that whatever happens during the German Revolution, there is no future for the Kaiser. But curiously, because of the Russian Revolution the previous year, where famously the Russian royal family are arrested and then eventually shot, everyone's very anxious this shouldn't happen again. And the answer to that, to the problem of the Kaiser, is that he simply gets on a train into the Netherlands. A very short journey over a border. And because the Netherlands is neutral during the First World War, the Queen of the Netherlands gives him, allows him to go into exile there. And in 1918, he's one of the most wanted men in the world. The French and the Americans and the British and the Belgians all want to put him on trial for war crimes. But because he's in the Netherlands, no one can touch him. And there are numerous discussions about how to kidnap him. But in the end, the Dutch protect him on the grounds that as a neutral state, that's what they're allowed to do. It's one of the extraordinary features of, if he was in China, the idea of anywhere in China being allowed to shield someone viewed as a criminal by other parts of China just couldn't happen. But in Europe, in this very small state of the Netherlands, even under the extreme circumstances in 1918, the Kaiser then lived until 1940 in his residence there, untouched by anyone. This is the second time where Lotharingia disappears. This is the height of the Third Reich, where again, as Napoleon had done in 1800, but going from the other side, the instinct of the Third Reich had been to absorb every part of what had been Lotharingia. And Belgium and the Netherlands have a sort of semi-existence, but they're clearly under German rule. And so again, for a time, this becomes a single border with France outside it, and German Reich inside it. And extraordinarily, throughout both world wars, Switzerland manages to maintain its neutrality. And again, you think, again, there's no other part of the world where such a small place would be allowed to continue in that way. This is the last actions of the Second World War on the Western Front. This is the Battle of the Bulge. Again, fought in near Bastogne, in the classic part of Lotharingia. Again, I spent a lot of time in this area. That's a wonderful part of Europe, all the way down to Aachen. This area, there's so many things to say about it, which I don't have time for. But it's marvelously interesting that the last great battle between the Americans and the Germans happens right in the heart of Lotharingia. And in fact, that the American General Staff using the same buildings that the German staff used in the First World War in Spa. So the same buildings in Spa are being used now by the Americans. And again, to me, to me, as someone who's wasted a lot of time traveling around Lotharingia, it seems to me obvious that that would happen. It's natural because it's the great break in the. And then this, I haven't had time to talk about this very much, but I do spend quite a lot of time talking about the Netherlands because it's such a fascinating part of Europe. But this is an extraordinary snap taken on the far west of Zeeland, or Zeeland, in the Netherlands. This is German troops who have surrendered, having defended Zeeland for months in isolation, and they surrendered to British, American, and Canadian troops. And this is like the last moment, as it were, of the Second World War in the West. And that's it. Of course, it's understood that the European Union, the original members of the European Union, the six, including Italy, which is also the north of Italy, is part of Lotharingia. It's unsurprising that the origins of the European Union are the states which had Lotharingian issues. So the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Germany, Italy, and unsurprisingly, they therefore are the core of the European Union, just as Brussels and Strasbourg are the two key cities of the European Union. And therefore, Lotharingia continues to thrive in the 21st century. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was a tour of European history, which was really most fascinating to listen to. And yes, a number of things, of course, struck one in listening. We started off by saying what prevents Europe from becoming a large state. Now, of course, you can sort of scratch your head and say, well, the smaller states actually did quite well in terms of being prosperous, in terms of having their citizens lead quite a good life. If you look at the Dutch, the Swiss, the Luxembourgers, the Belgians, and so on. So, looking at that world map you had at the beginning, and then this extraordinary map of the Holy Roman Empire with these literally thousands of little territories. The difference, of course, is, yes, this one. The difference, of course, is absolutely striking. And yet, in several of these small countries, people were doing extraordinarily well. And so, of course, this makes you think again about should we try and form sort of uniform, big European country? But that's just one of the issues. If we look at the map of 843, and we see what the original division, yes, this one, what the original division was like. In the end, France did rather well out of it. I mean, they took most of the middle part in the end. It took them a while, but it took them. They got most of it. Whereas Germany, of course, obviously shifted more to the east, but of this middle empire, I think all they got in the end was a small sort of part, sort of around Trier and things. That was all they got. Otherwise, they stayed pretty much the same. So again, that of course leads to a very different sort of theory, if you like. That of course a large country has much more potential to become even larger and to sort of and if it has a sort of uniform government, which France acquired over the Middle Ages, then of course it can become even larger. So there are definitely two sides of all this. You left out and it's not part of the story, of course, the role that England played in all this. I mean, I think, who was it? I think it was George III who finally dropped calling himself King of France. And this is at the end of the 18th century. So for a long time in all these maps, you would see the King of England butting in to
Yes.
all this as well.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, that's one thing I didn't really talk about is the way that the English are constantly interfering. Like the English love Lotharingia because it messes up France, and so they're always supporting. There's still lots of, obviously the English ruled Calais for many years. They ruled Dunkirk. They're always interfering in one way or another, but in the end they always kind of go home. Like they have an influence, but not an overwhelming influence. But yes, I mean they're a key ally for the Dutch at various points.
So there's one very, very, very minor, tiny little point in that photograph of the Kaiser and a few other people. Yes, that one. The one on the right is definitely not General Ludendorff.
No, it's a mistake, isn't it? Yes.
It looked quite different, and would have worn a different kind of uniform too. So,
yeah, no, it's not. It's definitely not Ludendorff.
No, I have no idea who it might be, but it's.
I think the odd thing is, I think this is after Ludendorff had left the headquarters. So I think this is literally like a few days beforehand. So it's just, yeah, I don't know why that chap's called Ludendorff in the picture.
Yeah. Well, whoever put that photo in the book obviously wanted to have Ludendorff in there somehow.
Yes, because Ludendorff was such a dreadful man, but this chap here looks actually quite cheering, like looks like rather a nice person.
Absolutely, but it's sort of it's sort of fascinating to see, I mean, the 1944 and First World War, and then going back and somehow connected to people in the 9th century. Now I think we have a few questions here from people. Wait a minute, let's see. There's Maria Mittelhaus who has a question of her own. Go ahead.
Okay, so actually this is quite fitting to that picture because I grew up in a small town it's on the border between Lower Saxony and North Rhine-Westphalia, but also close to the Dutch border. And my mom was a history teacher, and she always told me that the Kaiser actually went through that tiny town on his way to the Netherlands. And as a kid, I always found that quite fascinating because, it literally has 2 platforms, and I just couldn't imagine that the Kaiser would have gone through them,
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's a famous photo of the Kaiser on that platform, waiting to be allowed to proceed.
Yeah, I have to look at it.
And it's a very ghostly picture, and you can see it's just an accident. He looks like a ghost in the picture, but you can almost see his power disappearing. He's still wearing, all the people around him are still wearing those clothes, but they don't mean anything anymore. The empire has ended. So it's a very curious picture. But yes, there were great crowds apparently, because he was stuck there waiting for permission to carry on. Everyone in the town turned out to wave at them.
But I'm not sure he actually traveled through Germany. I think he went from Spa directly to the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken. It's very well documented actually, all that. And I think, and because when he sort of decided to leave, he was at the headquarters in Spa, and I think the train took him directly to a place called Amerongen in the Netherlands.
Oh, so maybe it was, on his way from Germany to Spa and then to the Netherlands, maybe. I'm not sure. I'll have to look it up. But the actual question was, because, I mean, of course, it's quite striking when you look at the maps and you see, all the tiny little bits changing color and going smaller or bigger. And of course, the UK or Great Britain didn't really change much at all. And especially none of these wars actually took place on British soil. And since there's, you know, so much nostalgia in the UK, discussions on literally everything these days, and so much, you know, rhetoric from the wars, especially the Second World War, I'm wondering what you think the impact of this was on the English psyche in particular back then, but also nowadays, that this was always so remote and it was never really, on their shores.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. If you look at this wonderful map here, you can definitely see that the issue for how Europe works is the way that, in the end, England is defended by water and has other interests. And so it's concerned about this area, but it's not overwhelmingly concerned. But then this is an interesting map because it shows how equally Germany, like the great concern for Germany for many generations is obviously fighting against the Ottoman Empire. And you know, soldiers from all over Western Germany, they all head east. You know, they all work for the Habsburgs, fighting their way across in the end down to the Balkans. But this is a generation, many generations go by. You know, and it's how people organize their lives. So Germany is very much distracted. You know, that the Germans look east and southeast. The English look out to sea, whereas for France's only real concern. You know, the Pyrenees effectively protects France from Spain and protects Spain from France. But from a French point of view, this is an endless interest to them. And what's surprising is the way that, in the end, even France fails. You know, the French, their only concern really is to, if you're interested in increasing the territory, which all these dynasties are, is to absorb these places along here. And in the end, the French don't. You know, these wars that go on for decades, they result in quite a small amount of it being taken over by France, which again, to me, implies there's something about the nature of the people living in this area, which just means that they see off these invaders in this strange way. They're always able to come up with some solution which allows them, in the end, despite terrible setbacks, to survive. I mean, the very existence of Luxembourg, you know, why is Luxembourg there? It's quite extraordinary. You know, Luxembourg has managed to survive every change of regime. You know, it's managed to somehow make itself sufficiently interesting to people that it pops up again, it disappears for a while and just comes to the surface again. Very odd. You know.
I have a question here from Nick Jeffcott. It's two questions. What about Lotharingia in A, the 100 Years' War, and B, the 30 Years' War? So, that's good.
Well, I do cover them in my book. I mean, I think, you know, the 100 Years' War, obviously there is a lot of fighting in the north. So many famous battles. Again, it's like I think for the English, Amiens is always this very important place. Calais and Amiens. You know, Calais is the port and Amiens is the town. And it just keeps on coming up as being, you know, and the valley of the Somme, you know, the great battles of the 100 Years' War, Battle of Crécy, Battle of Agincourt, happen really to do with maneuvering around the Somme. And then during the First World War, a lot of British troops talk about how interesting it is. You know, here we are fighting in exactly the same place that our ancestors fought. And it was very self-conscious. People were very aware of this idea that Amiens, this area, had this ancient heritage. And also that Calais, of course, Calais was ruled by the English for a long time, and that starts during the 100 Years' War. Yes, the 100 Years' War happens in important ways in the north, but a lot of the action is really further south as well, I mean, in Gascony and so on. And then in the 30 Years' War, I suppose 30 Years' War, it's the relationship between the Netherlands and its surroundings is extremely important. And there's all kinds of neutrality around here as well, like these ancient bishoprics, the bishopric of Liège, bishopric of Munster. these have always been extremely important because they are genuinely religious territories, and armies are always marching over them. But the Treaties of Westphalia, which happened in Munster, it's not surprising that the treaties that end the 1648 wars are again in a neutral zone that allowed the Germans and the French and the Spanish and others to all join together under neutral circumstances here, which again is an oddity. You know, it's a strange aspect of this whole thing. So, and I think in the 100 Years' War and in the 30 Years' War, it's an important split, and it just carries on the conversation. But yes, I have relevant chapters on this issue.
Yes, I have another question here from Paul Daniels, who starts off by saying, "Thank you, Simon." And then comes the question, would you say that there is any kind of or trace of Lotharingian identity, or has it always just been the leftovers of the French-German confrontation?
Yes, I would say, for example, most obviously Belgian identity, for example, is very Lotharingian. You know, the Belgians are very keen not to be French and not to be Dutch. Mm. And that's a kind of negative identity. But also it's a positive identity because it's also to do with being, on the whole, Catholic. It's to do with, again, this Dutch-speaking and the French-speaking elements in Belgium had to somehow get along with each other, even though obviously there were a lot of disputes between them. But also it's a kind of, it's strange how Belgian identity does go back a very, very long way. You know, like when it is, like in this map, as part of the Spanish Netherlands, it is clearly a different place from the Northern Netherlands. It's not just religion, though religion is very important, but it clearly has its own view of itself, which makes people living in the Spanish Netherlands willing to defend themselves against both the French and the Dutch. And I think the whole issue of like further south, obviously Swiss identity continues to be overwhelmingly important. Again, you can see that as having its origins in Lotharingia. But also I would say that places like Burgundy and Lorraine and Alsace, they all have a funny like atmosphere, I think, which is different. You know, it's smaller, you know. But when you think about Lorraine was a separate state, really until the 18th century, and the rulers of Lorraine were very interesting people, and you can visit their somewhere like Nancy is still is built as a royal city, with an identity separate from Germany or France. Again, I think that's kind of curious. You can still see places like Nancy as in Strasbourg, of course. And the one thing I haven't really talked about is, of course, the way that the Rhine as a whole, you know, you have a Rhine identity, this whole series of major towns, you know, Cologne and Bonn and Düsseldorf and so on, and the way that they have a non-Prussian identity, which isn't Lotharingian, but which is definitely a sort of far west Germany identity, which again fades into places like Trier or Aachen. You know, again, they're very much right on the edge of German identity, and have always had a remove from Berlin, which remains today, I think, in
England. Somewhere in the book, you have this wonderful story of this village that is sort of half Belgian and half Dutch, and it's all sort of intertwined because sort of the border runs through the pub and everything.
Yes.
And it's a sort of wonderful example, really, of how the whole history of, well, what is now the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Switzerland, even Italy, and of course Germany, is very, very much sort of intertwined with lots and lots of historical little bridges and little sort of special relationships that are really quite amazing once you sort of start digging them up.
Yes, my favourite is Neutral Moresnet, which was a tiny separate territory created at the end of the wars with Napoleon, it's just west of Aachen, and it was a triangle of territory because there was a zinc mine there, which Napoleon had sold to someone, and during these discussions, no one could work out who should own it, and so there's this small, tiny bit of territory just here, which had its own, which was a single town and a mine, but it existed as a separate territory from 1815 to 1914, and it ruled itself. It was too small to have its own fire brigade, so I think the Belgians and the Prussians took turns to supply a fire engine if there was a fire. There was this famous spot where you could stand on 3 borders between Moresnet, Belgium, and Prussia. It's a very moving place. There's a wonderful little museum about Neutral Moresnet. And just before the First World War, a large number of Esperanto speakers arrived there because they thought Moresnet was so small that you could actually get everyone in Moresnet speaking Esperanto. This was resisted by the people living there who didn't want to speak Esperanto. And for them, the First World War arrived just in time because the Esperantists left. But if you go there now, it is a fascinating place because it is both. There's a very moving little church which has a war memorial to the First World War and lists all the people who died in Moresnet during the First World War. And but some of them fought with the French army, and some with the German army, and some with the Belgian army, and it refuses to say which was which. So its last neutral act was to create this war memorial before it became part of Belgium at the end of the war, as a sort of symbol of the fact for 100 years it had succeeded in being a separate neutral state. But again, it could only happen in Lotharingia.
Could you just show this map, the map of Charles the Bold's time? You have one wonderful, yes, I think, yes, that's the one. I mean, if you look at that, governing that kind of a country, I mean, must have been an absolute nightmare. I mean, with all those, all these little bits and pieces, speaking different languages with other people's territories sort of in between and everything, and yet it worked quite well for several generations, if you like. So I think there is a sort of moral there that says complex political situation, complex governance situation isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I suppose one thing that Europeans have learned over these 1,200 years that you were telling us about is how to cope with complex situations. So I think the last thing we should do is try and organize Europe in a sort of uniform way, in a kind of sort of United States of Europe way. I think we must allow for the complexity of identities, of loyalties, of languages, of territories to prosper within Europe, and I think with a certain amount of goodwill, an intelligent solution may be found.
Yes, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, this is a fascinating map because it is such a mess, and yet it worked pretty well, and all the individual bits were extremely rich. Very successful places, and in the end, Charles the Bold was only ever a duke. That's what's so interesting about him. He intended to make himself a king, but effectively, the disaster for him was that he was a duke. Say that he was Duke of Luxembourg thanks to the Holy Roman Empire, and he was Duke of Burgundy thanks to France. And so he was always one step down from being truly independent. and he was killed before he could make himself king. But possibly if he tried to make himself king, it would have ended what you can see in this map.
I mean, any modern civil servant looking at this would say, look, this is the first thing we must change. We must put it all into a uniform structure and organize the whole thing. And there it is, working terribly well with a very, very sort of complex sort of structure.
Yeah, it's chaos, isn't it?
Yes, so special thank you for reminding us of all this, really. So, are there any other questions from the audience, which unfortunately we can't see? But would anybody like to ask a question via the chat device? No? Nicholas Jeffcoat has added a new message that says, Simon, I forgot to start with a thank you. So thank you now for a fascinating talk and your thoughtful reply to my two-part question. So,
you're very welcome. It's a sadly constrained format because I normally look forward to spending a couple of hours having drinks with everyone afterwards. So they can ask all kinds of questions. So, I'm happy to answer any questions, but there's no opportunity, sadly.
So, if there's nothing else, I'm looking at Murray. Do you have any further questions? No. So, with that, thank you very, very much for giving us a real insight into a part of Europe's history that one doesn't usually remember. And so I hope the book's doing very well in both English and German. Will there be a French translation as well, or is there one? Or
no, I think the French always assume that they can do their own history. So
okay. And they probably wouldn't enjoy what you said about Napoleon anyway. So
no, exactly. No, I think they're possibly not interested. I'm very grateful to you both for inviting me, and I've enjoyed this very much, and I hope it's been useful for everyone.
Yeah. So, thank you, and with that we close tonight's session, and for the audience, I might add, we will be back with a new event in the same format again pretty soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And I didn't say get home safely, but I will say stay well and don't catch the virus. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.